Chapter 13 of Clearing Weather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynette Calkins. Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 13. Far Visions. It was Timothy Tripp whose privilege it was to fire those saluting guns as the Jocasta doubled Branscombe Head and stood in toward the harbor. "There," he said, as the last report went echoing and re-echoing all down the length of the rocky point. "That will give Henrietta Sparrow something to think about." What she thought was written plainly upon her face as she stood with the rest of the crowded gathering upon the wharf. That pinched face, which had never before shown real feeling of any sort, but down which, now, the slow tears of scarcely credulous joy were running. The throng was growing ever greater, as group after group of hurried, breathless people came running down the steep way to the waterside. "Have you heard? Can you believe?" they kept crying to one another. More than one woman was sobbing aloud in sheer hysterical relief after long-endured sorrow. Questions, speculations, and marvelings ran up and down until suddenly a voice at the outer edge of the crowd said, "Yonder comes young Mr. Drury." There was a hush of dead silence as Nicholas, hastening and panting like the rest, came down through the shipyards and out upon the dock. No one could find words to speak to him. The nearest woman drew a sharply audible breath of pain at the look upon his face. Pretenses were all swept aside, and the strain of that endless, anguished watching was only in part giving away before the almost impossible miracle of hopes fulfilled. Caleb Harmon alone stepped forward. "Which boat, sir?" he asked. Nicholas indicated the little yawl moored at the far end of the dock, and the two tumbled into her, cast loose, and got up the small square sail. As they swung out into the basin of the harbor, there indeed was the Jocasta, clothed in full panoply of sail, serene and steady, moving toward them, her canvas full, her tall bow rising and falling with the running waves. She was not now that proud, untested beauty which had set out with all their hearts and hopes aboard her. She was a worn and weather-scarred ship of world-wide voyaging. Her sails were no longer snowy white as those two had last seen them. They were gray, and some of them patched. What breezes had filled them? What storms had torn them asunder? Ah, how little it mattered now, since there had been winds to waft her home. Easily and beautifully she came toward them, leaning a little to the quartering wind. The men on her deck were beginning to be recognizable. A small, monkey-like figure clinging to the shrouds and waving his hat in a very frenzy was quite unmistakable. Then in the stern appeared that beacon to lay a course by. Michael's red head, as a glorious, tumultuously joyful hail came across the water. "Nicholas! Nicholas!" The yawl drew alongside and dropped her sail. Not even the salute of guns had so rocked the echoes of Branscombe harbor as did the cheer that went up from ship and shore when Nicholas Drury climbed on board the Jocasta. It was no small task, that telling of the tale on both sides of what had happened in those 2 tense years. Nicholas at first summed up his record briefly. "We worked and waited," he said. But bit by bit, as the days passed, came casual mention of Darius Corland, the new government, the brig Betsy, the election of General George Washington as President of the United States. With the returned wanderers, it seemed, however, that the story would never have done. The recounting began at that moment when, after the first excited greetings, Nicholas had asked, "But, Michael, where is it that you have been?" And his friend had cried out in desperate dismay over their having failed to have news of the Jocasta's far destination. the West Indies, and Raoul Laroche, the touching at their first South American port of Rio.
Do not let me begin to tell you of Rio harbor. I must get on with my tale.
The battle with the Horn, the long cruise which ended in the bay before Wickenanish's village. That was as far as the record could go during the first day. The narrative was interrupted 100 times, for Michael to greet Etienne Bardot, for him to walk up the hill to the Blackbird Inn, where Thomas Drury clasped his hand and said little but, "Well done," yet conveyed a whole world of approbation and delight in those 2 words. Phoebe Harmon threw both her arms about Michael's neck and kissed him, while he, looking over her shoulder all the while, had his eyes so riveted upon Dolly Drury that her dancing, saucy smile grew suddenly faltering, and in the end her greeting of her brother's friend was in brief but shakily happy words. The days which followed fairly buzzed with activities. The unloading of the Jocasta, the disposing of her cargo, and distributing her profits, or a proportion of the goods which she had brought home, among all those who had combined in sending her to sea. There came to be a saying in that countryside which lasted through 2 generations, "Dowered like a maid of Branscombe." All those young ladies, some brave, some hesitating and slightly tearful, all who had shared in the great venture, got back their own in such richness of silks, embroidered shawls, India muslins, and willow-patterned plaits, that their own homes and those of their children's children were distinguished for household treasures through long years to come. Some of the less romantic and the more thrifty chose to take the return for their venture of linens in the form of chests of tea or bags of coffee, which their merchant fathers sold to good advantage to swell their daughters' marriage portions. Just as on the day of the Jocasta's launching, men of worth had left their counting-houses to visit the shipyards of Branscombe, those same men now came crowding about the long building beside the Drury wharf, in spirited competition to buy what she had brought home. Mr. Rufus Craythorpe was almost the first among them, with a cautiously limited offer for tea, which was immediately overwhelmed by the eager bidding of 6 more.
"But, Nicholas," he protested, "do you not remember that I was the last one to stand by you when all other custom had fallen away?"
Michael answered for his friend.
"Mr. Drury has told me that you were, indeed, one of the very last who told him that he was no judge of a ship," he observed, whereat Mr. Craythorpe had the grace to redden.
Soft-hearted Nicholas, made more understanding of others' disappointment by what he had suffered in the last few months, was troubled by the little man's grievously downcast face. "I can repay you the mortgage on the Blackbird Inn, and a year of added interest to conclude the loan at once," he offered. Mr. Craythorpe brightened a trifle, for, though he was loth to take his hands off that pleasant property, here at least was a trifle of unexpected gain. But his face was still long, and his tone was pathetic, as he declared, "A man's prominence in the commercial world of this neighborhood is measured, just now, by what China, Java, and India goods he has to sell." Michael had gauged the situation with singular quickness from such brief information as his friend had given him. He saw that Nicholas, so happy that he wished happiness to everyone else, was about to give way, and broke in with a determined suggestion. "Just what was your offer to Mr. Drury for the charting of the brig Betsy? I think we could manage to spare you some Chinese goods whose worth would amount to the equal of that sum." With this, the insistent Mr. Craythorpe was forced to be content. Since there was promise of good profit on every dollar's worth of tea and silk, he went away openly sorrowing, for the first time in his life, that he had driven so close a bargain. In the brief, quiet hour at the end of the day's business, the 2 friends would sit in talk together in the little room above the wharf, where Michael would carry forward the still unfinished account of the Jocasta's adventures.
We were nearer to losing her in that typhoon in the China Sea than by any risk of Indians or pirates," he said. "Timothy Tripp says that your handling of her was all that kept the whole of you from destruction," Nicholas insisted. "Captain Douglas cannot speak too highly of you as commander of the ship." Michael shook his head in stout denial. "When a storm of such a kind has a vessel in its clutch, her living or perishing is determined by the man who built her, not the man who sails her," he maintained. Captain Douglas had not recovered until after they had passed the Malacca Straits, when, as he himself told Nicholas, the difficult portion of the voyage was over. When Michael sailed again, he would be amply qualified to be master of his ship. Under Michael, the Jocasta had touched at Batavia, and under Captain Douglas at Calcutta, but only briefly, for "every man of us was ravenous for home." Often Etienne Bardot joined the two at the counting-house, and paced restlessly about the little room while the others sat talking. Great news had come for him by the slow carriage of messages of those days. With the uprising of the people of Paris, the revolution had actually begun. Until his ship could return from Halifax to take him home, Etienne must wait, with scant patience, with 1,000 speculations, with no outward lamentation, but with such chafing and fretting of the inward spirit that, as he said, he was "ill company for home-coming wanderers." "Ah, liberty! It is the great adventure of the history of our times, and of all time for many years to come," was the burden of what he kept saying. "To gain it, to be worthy to keep it. One by one the nations will see what others have attained, and will hazard their all to win freedom for themselves. You in America have taken the first step. You have had your turn. Now it is ours. God help us. God guide us." An English brig had recently sailed from Boston for London, upon which he might have taken passage, but he had refrained, knowing that he would arrive the sooner by waiting for his own swifter and more direct ship. Yet 2 travellers had departed from Branscombe to go to sea upon that British merchantman, Darius Corland and Joseph Ryle. It was said among Mr. Corland's acquaintance that he was to travel in England for a space of time, to consult with certain great kinsfolk over matters of family property. The man of law was to make this pleasant tour with him, that all the great man's affairs should be well tended. "A liar to the end," commented Michael when he heard this version of Darius Corland's reasons for departure. Only those 3 good comrades there in the counting-house knew that he could never come back. In time, after many prosperous voyages of the Jocasta, that property which had been suffered to pass into his hands so that the shipyards might continue, would, they all hoped, come back to Thomas Drury. Already Mr. Hugh Hollister, as broadly smiling as though it were himself who was coming out of poverty into prosperity, was preparing deeds for the retransfer of the big house beyond the town. The sale had been arranged with Mr. Ryle and Mr. Hollister as agents. Mr. Corland had not appeared in the matter. Nicholas had seen Darius Corland, the day before he was to set out for Boston, go rolling in his chaise down the post road, past the Blackbird Inn, for the last time. He had drawn in his horses, and sat holding them as they champed and jerked, while he thought for a moment, then had loosed the reins and gone rumbling away in a cloud of dust. That impulse, that desire to come in to say farewell to his lifelong friend Thomas Drury, he had abandoned for very shame of looking a truly upright man in the face. They had been speaking of him, these 3 in the counting-room, after Mr. Craythorpe had gone. "Darius brought about his own banishment," Etienne said, "and he has forced himself to go from a new free country, where peace has come at last, where the opportunities are great, where he could be a much looked to man if he would, back to the old world, where war, suffering, and immeasurable tumult are about to break forth everywhere.
But England is at peace now, observed Nicholas.
It is peace for a moment, returned Etienne, but only truce before another and more terrible struggle. That battle for liberty which you in America have so stoutly won will seem but a small thing beside the contest which is to arise on our side of the seas. It must be. It cannot be otherwise than that all Europe will be plunged into war as the old tyrants fall and new ones strive to rise up in their places. Then, above all times, we will be thankful for America and her ships. England, France, Spain, and Holland, they all have been warring these many years, and have sunk vessels faster than they can build them. The world will soon see a famine in ships, so that, with the men of Europe under arms and unable to till the soil, it must be by food and goods carried by the vessels of America that our countries are to subsist. The Jocasta and all her sisters to come must spread their sails wide.
He had talked with such vigor that he had freed himself a little from his restless disquiet, and stood still beside the window.
I weary you with my haranguing, he said with a quiet smile. Therefore we will turn to lighter things. As I came down the street past the house of Monsieur Hollister, Timothy Tripp came out with a face all radiant, and bade me, and all of you also, to his wedding this day fortnight. I shall not be here, but you must make ready for a great festivity. Michael, will it be your duty, or Mr. Hollister's, to give the bride away?
Certainly, Henrietta Sparrow, with that dower chest carried home from China, could no longer say that she was not sufficiently prepared for marriage. Her object through all those years was to have more household goods than other spinsters, since she was so ill-equipped with charms and graces. But now it was not really the possession of such treasure which had brought her to give consent at last. Honest affection for Timothy Tripp had got the better, during those long months of sorrow, of the cautious, domineering nature which she showed to all the world. A strangely assorted pair they were, but they suited each other to the point of promising much happiness. The other gifts of Leung Si-poon had been distributed to their proper owners. The jade bowl for Nicholas now stood on the top of the cupboard, below the drawing of the Jocasta. Thomas Drury played chess with a most beautifully carved company of ivory kings, queens, knights, and castles. Captain Douglas had gone home to Milford with his bird and flower rugs, to make glad the heart of the daughter who was mistress of his house. Michael had presented to Dolly the brocade-wrapped package, and had watched her unfold an oblong, delicately carved ivory box, which, when opened, showed a glitter of gold and jewels, which made her exclaim in delighted astonishment. Here were silver and gold pins and combs, inlaid with jade and jasper, such as Chinese ladies wear in their hair. "Surely you are mistaken. They cannot be for me, for one of whom the nice, good Chinaman knew nothing," she said. "And look, look! He could never have purposed that these should be mine." Round-eyed, she held up a string of milky pearls.
"They are for you,"
Michael insisted. "But how could Leung Si-poon have ever heard of me?" she protested. "What could he have said to make you think that he was sending me so marvelous a gift?"
He put the statement in his Oriental idiom, which I cannot quite translate to you now," Michael explained grandly but vaguely. "But there is certainly no doubt of his purpose and his meaning. He sent them for you." 3 days later the French ship lay in Branscombe harbor, and Etienne was to sail at dawn. His impatience was gone now. He was very quiet and gentle as he went about, saying farewell to the multitude of friends which even such a short stay had made for him. It chanced that in the afternoon he, Nicholas, and Michael had all ascended to the loft of the shed, so that Nicholas might show them where the letter of Darius Courland had been so safely hidden. They were intent in talk, telling one another those things for which there would soon be no opportunity, and they sat down upon the hay to finish what clamored to be said. There was no need for darkness or secrecy now. They could fling wide to the sunshine all the windows of the loft, the 2 on opposite sides, under the peak of the roof, and the small ones under the eaves. One of the little openings framed a view of the garden, with Thomas Drury in his armchair under the plum trees, with Dolly sitting beside him reading aloud. Dolly, with soft autumn wind in her hair, and with one of the Manchu jade and silver combs holding the ruffled curls in place. The other looked down toward the harbor and showed the shoulder of a point, with comfortably nestled houses basking in the sun, showed the basin of the harbor and the Jocasta swinging at her anchor. The murmur of Dolly's reading came up to them, the voices of the blackbirds in the marsh, and the cool sweep of the long waves on the beach beyond. A droning bumblebee wandered in out of the sunshine, flew hither and yon for a moment, talking to himself, and then launched out into the brightness beyond the opposite window. The talk was all of the future, of the great things which the world was presently to see. Michael, although he was as eager of speech as the others, and missed no word of what they had said, held his glance steadily upon Dolly, sitting below under the trees. The vision of Etienne Bardot, both of body and mind, seemed fixed upon some splendid dream for his own country, seen by him somewhere beyond the turmoil of destruction into which she had just now fallen. As for Nicholas, leaning against a beam beside the others, his eyes were fixed on that round of glittering water and on the Jocasta lifting to the ripples of the incoming tide. Thus these 3 friends sat together in the hay and reconstructed the world. They talked of what might come to France and to England, but most of all what it was that America was to do. Some of what they guessed was too visionary to be fulfilled, but in much of their peering into the years to come, they foresaw rightly. They were looking forward upon a stretch of years to which we, in our age, are looking back. It is not mere romance and sentiment which makes men regard with such depth of feeling that period when great white ships went out of all America's ports to carry to the world more than the mere cargoes in their holds, to bring back more than mere wealth in gold and silver. It was the beginning of a new epoch, the first step forward of a country which only a few years past had been an exploited colony. First she had been a war-torn field of rebellion, then a struggling group of states which must learn union, must find money, must gather experience in a form of rule so little tried in modern times. Men said even then that a republic was a government of blundering, clumsy effort, yet were forced at last to see that it was also one of glorious opportunities. And now America was setting forth upon that path which was to bring her to world power, which was to lead to vast things of which those 3 in the hay could only remotely dream. The twilight came. The voice below fell into silence. The sound of the sea came ever louder through the gloom. The shadowy outline of the Jocasta was only faintly visible against the dull silver of the harbor. Etienne Bardot got up from his place. His ship sailed at daylight, and he must presently go on board. "Good-bye," he said.
Things begin and end, but we who have our work to do must ever go forward.
End of chapter 13. End of Clearing Weather by Cornelia Meigs.